everyone, and welcome to this edition of Energy Quick Chat, where we rub minds with stakeholders and players in the energy market. I am your show host, Justina Okechukwu. North Africa is home to some of the world's largest oil and gas reserves, and the hydrocarbon sector plays a crucial role in the economies of countries such as Algeria, Libya, and Egypt. Despite the decline in investment in this sector, some positive developments in countries like Egypt have seen a major shift after it announced a $19.5 billion investment plan to develop its natural gas sector in 2020. To help us understand the factors at play on the region is Colby Connelly, Senior Analyst for Research and Advisory at Energy Intelligence. Thank you for joining us on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Now, how strategic is North Africa's hydrocarbon sector to the global industry?
Well, the countries that I spend a lot of time looking at in North Africa are the very same ones that you just mentioned, those being Algeria, Libya, and Egypt. And right off the bat, the obvious variable there that's extremely important is that Algeria and Libya are two core OPEC members. They each pump an upwards of 1 million barrels a day in crude oil. Libya is fairly vulnerable to disruption given its political situation. You do see a tangible market impact when production is taken offline very suddenly from a place like that. Egypt has 2 LNG export terminals on its northern coast. It's got just over 12 million tons per year in export capacity, and it wants to leverage that capacity to become a regional gas export hub, certainly based in North Africa, but drawing on a lot of Eastern Mediterranean gas resources as well. And then finally, just to kind of wrap up a brief overview of where the region fits strategically, both Algeria and Egypt are angling to try and become major suppliers of green hydrogen to European markets in the future, which is also an outcome that's a ways away and certainly far from a guarantee. But that's a brief view of where the region fits into the global picture.
Okay, so how much of foreign investment inflows in North Africa is attracting, and how has it impacted the industry's output, among other things?
That's a question that mainly impacts Egypt and Algeria for the moment. Algeria did sign around $6 billion worth of new production sharing agreements last year. That's partially due to the fact that it recently did an overhaul of its oil and gas sector law, but is also certainly motivated by the energy crisis as well. And it's probably worth mentioning that a lot of those agreements, most of them, in fact, were signed by international oil companies that are already present in Algeria. So, for example, Eni of Italy or Occidental Petroleum from the U.S. But those new deals may improve the investor confidence in Algeria. You've had more limited exits. BP exited last year, but it only had fairly minor assets there. And then, of course, Italy, is a large importer of Algerian gas. So its involvement there through Eni is certainly a big driver of that investment. Egypt has two bid rounds open currently. Only one of which focuses on offshore gas, although it does plan 2 more in other areas of the country later in the year. But really, the activity that's taking place there already in terms of exploration is really what's been of real interest, and I think has the potential to certainly drive more investment. Chevron made a 3.5 trillion cubic foot discovery offshore there earlier this year, and there are a number of wells planned for the Mediterranean in the coming year. If there are more of these high potential discoveries, then that could certainly drive greater investment. But the crisis itself hasn't necessarily been enough to just automatically have companies pouring in. In terms of actual output, it's sort of too soon to say what's been accomplished, partially because it does take a lot of time and investment to raise production. But there are also obstacles as well. Egyptian gas output actually declined a bit this year, partially due to a production cap at the key Zohr offshore field. But also Cairo had to implement demand management measures over the summer to sustain LNG exports and limit domestic gas consumption. That also included ramping up liquids burn in its power sector, greater use of things like diesel fuel. These are things that kind of hurt some of the investor confidence in the local sector. And despite some of the laws and terms on offer improving, in addition to this crisis that you've seen in Europe, those are two very powerful factors, but they're not necessarily enough to drive a total turnaround in upstream investment.
Now, since you've mentioned the things that drive the factors that drive those things in those sectors, in terms of global and regional dynamics, what factors are most critical in shaping the sector, and what will they shift in the years to come?
Well, there are a couple of demand side factors that I think are going to be incredibly important to watch in North Africa. Long-term European gas demand is naturally going to be a pretty critical item. There's been some frustration expressed among producers, not just in North Africa, but elsewhere in the world. This is a dynamic you've seen with Qatar as well, that, have some frustration, I think, with maybe some European apprehensiveness over committing to more long-term supply agreements. The longer term agreements definitely help underpin the kind of upstream investment and will help to reverse the underinvestment that contributed to some of this supply tightness to begin with. So that's certainly a key item there, especially given Algeria being connected to Europe by pipeline, because if European demand declines significantly in the medium to long term, the pipelines can't just be redirected to Asia. You'd have to depend more on LNG for that. So that's certainly a key structural limitation there. But also, I was talking about demand in Egypt before. So local energy demand is a big factor as well. In Egypt, you have a gas sector that's had issues both on the supply side and the demand side. But with Egyptian demand growth in particular, one thing that we've heard and that we've noticed is that Israeli gas producers, which are, of course, just over the border to the east, are pretty bullish on the Egyptian market, but not on Egypt as an export route per se. There's interest in expanding pipeline capacity to send more gas to Egypt at the same time that these operators are expressing quite a bit of interest in floating FLNG from Israeli waters. That doesn't send a signal of particularly high confidence in the way that the sector may be managed in Egypt. There's a precedent for Egypt diverting gas flows away from its LNG export plants to service the domestic market. That's a major source of apprehension for those that are looking at Egypt as an export route. Algeria has some similar constraints. Demand growth is a major issue. Demand and consumption have gotten to a point where they're really approaching about 50% of production. So if there aren't more efforts made to sort of curtail the domestic demand, which is so high partially because of subsidies and that gas being sold at artificially low prices, this really has the potential to long-term kind of constrain the volumes that are available for export. In Libya, of course, that's a different picture because there's a domestic conflict that really kind of remains the key variable for the sector. Libya NOC has stated that they want to raise gas output. They'd like to try and hit 2 million barrels a day in oil output, begin developing renewables, all of these, which are great things. But, with a government that's divided between two halves of the country, as well as an NOC and an oil ministry that, really don't like to coordinate with each other, it's sort of hard to bet on significant near-term progress in the Libyan upstream, despite the fact that firms like Total and ENI have shown a clear interest in investing there.
So, at what level is North Africa's energy mixing right now?
North Africa is a big gas-consuming region. And that's we think of it in terms of production a lot, but on the demand side, Algeria and Egypt certainly are very large gas consumers. I mentioned the bullishness on the Egyptian gas market before. That's certainly the case across the North Africa region, but also the wider Middle East as well. So I mentioned, that as being a factor that has the ability to impact demand. But outside of fossil fuel production, outside of hydrocarbon consumption, there has been some more limited progress on building out renewable power capacity. Morocco is sort of the standout example there, but it's not a big energy producing country to begin with, so there are certainly some energy security issues at play there as well. Egypt has made progress there too, but it's still, renewables there still do not account for an enormous portion of its power generation. So the key, I think, will be to see whether or not that momentum can be sustained. One particular item pertaining to Egypt that's definitely notable, I think partially for the impact you've seen it have elsewhere in the Mideast, is long-term plan to develop nuclear energy. But that's something that's been agreed to with Rosatom of Russia for some time. And it's experienced multiple delays. I think that the latest startup target is something like 2028. So the idea of a nuclear-powered Egypt is far from certain. But in terms of low carbon, low emissions power generation that has the potential to displace significant volumes of oil and gas from the energy mix, that would certainly go a long way. But it certainly has a long way to go before it will actually be in place.
Mm. I know you mentioned some things about the challenges, but speak to me more about some of the key challenges that North Africa faces as it transitions into a more just and sustainable energy system.
Sure. The potential for North Africa to make much greater use of cleaner energy, especially where power generation is concerned, is there. I don't think anybody watching is going to be surprised to hear that North Africa has high solar energy potential. That's quite well established. And in fact, if you're Egypt, there's wind in the mix as well. So I think a lot of these challenges are really going to be policy related. Energy subsidies that promote consumption of heavy natural gas consumption, but also diesel and gasoline in the transport sector as well are very hard to wind down. They drive up domestic use based on these artificially low prices, but they also really weaken the national balance sheet because of the need to spend so heavily on these subsidies. The idea that cheap domestic energy supply will help foster development and reduce poverty it's not totally untrue, but it's not an idea that's been implemented particularly efficiently. So there are certainly a lot of challenges to rolling those back. In terms of building out cleaner power supply, there were a lot of announcements out of Egypt prior to hosting COP27. There was an expectation of seeing its hydrogen strategy, but ultimately that wasn't rolled out. It was reportedly due to some bureaucratic infighting. Algeria also had a solar bid round that was open that's really gone nowhere. Though some more attractive terms that may increase the likelihood of investors emerging are reportedly coming. It's still really struggled to develop in a substantial way. So I think the ability and the desire for investors to show up and build out some of these cleaner power projects is certainly there, but it's kind of on the policymakers in the region to get the commercial terms to a place where they're attractive enough for those developments to move forward. And then I think with Algeria and Egypt looking to become large hydrogen producers, specifically green hydrogen producers, the way that hydrogen markets develop will certainly be another fairly considerable risk. Egypt certainly wants to use that renewables potential that I mentioned before. Algeria has the idea that its existing pipeline capacity will really be a key factor in supplying Europe. But at the end of the day, if hydrogen markets don't really develop in line with the expectations that are kind of underpinning a lot of these strategies, then a lot of time and resources may be spent on trying to turn a country into a key producer when its focus perhaps should have been elsewhere. That's not a guarantee that it'll happen that way, But both countries, for the time being, are focusing very heavily on green hydrogen rather than blue, which comes from natural gas, but for the moment is still cheaper to produce than green hydrogen. So developing those kind of new energy resources, again, I mean, the potential is quite high, but there's some fairly significant policy and commercial challenges that have to be overcome in the near term for them to be successful.
Now, it looks like you've touched on this, but what's your outlook on the region and what factors are likely at play here?
My outlook for North Africa is one of, I think, cautious optimism. There's huge potential for both oil and gas developments, but also for new energies to grow as well. But the potential alone is not something that's going to automatically allow this to happen. Certainly for Libya, there's enormous potential there, but without a resolution to the conflict, that's something that will certainly face more obstacles. But, for the moment, North Africa is not a region that we're really thinking of as being as politically volatile as other parts of the world. It certainly has that in addition to a large resource base working in its favor. So, getting the policy support for investors to feel like they really want to spend heavily in North Africa is not the same as just having the potential there. So I think some of that has been recognized. I mean, you've seen that with Algeria's new oil law that predates the war. So clearly the recognition of a need to do something was there for a while. And Egypt has improved some of its commercial terms as well. These are really small steps in terms of overall sector governance. I mean, there's still, I think, quite a bit that needs to be done and needs to be seen in order for an outlook that says, yes, the region is absolutely going to live up to its potential. But on a country by country basis, I'd say these are definitely the largest factors that influence my outlook on the region as a whole.
Thank you for those insights and deep analysis into that region. And thank you so much, Colby Connelly, Senior Analyst, Research and Advisory at Energy Intelligence, for that overview of North Africa's energy industry.
Thanks so much for having me.
And that's it on your Energy Quick Chat this week. Thank you, everyone, for watching. I am Justina Okechukwu. Bye for now.